You ever have that split second of sheer panic when you pat your pockets and your phone's not there?
Oh, definitely.
Or maybe that little anxiety spike when you see your battery dipping into the red zone?
Mm-hmm. That low battery warning, yeah.
It's a pretty common modern experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out there's actually a name for that feeling.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that this seemingly everyday experience of unease has actually been identified. It's been studied as a real phenomenon.
Nomophobia.
Nomophobia, N-O-M-ophobia.
Exactly. Nomophobia.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, it's the fear of being without a working mobile phone.
Right, and it's not just like a quirky new thing either, is it?
No, not at all.
If you look at how mobile phone use has just absolutely skyrocketed since, 2005, especially across Europe and Asia,
Oh, massively.
you start to see just how fundamental these devices have become in our daily lives.
Exactly. And if we kind of zoom out a bit, this really underscores our increasing reliance on these pocket computers.
And the potential vulnerabilities that, come along with that reliance.
It makes sense.
So in this deep dive, our goal is to really unpack nomophobia. We want to understand what it is, what might be driving it, how it shows up in our lives, and what the research is telling us about its impact. We've got a range of studies and reports here that really delve into this contemporary anxiety.
Okay, great. So let's get right to it then. What exactly is nomophobia? Where did the term come from?
Well, the term itself is relatively new, actually. It was coined back in 2008 by the UK Post Office, believe it or not. They commissioned a study by YouGov, the research organization,
Right.
to get a better understanding of the anxieties that mobile phone users were experiencing. And that's where the term nomophobia, short for no mobile phone phobia, first appeared.
No mobile phone phobia. Pretty straightforward name. So what did that initial study actually find?
Well, what's really striking is just the sheer number of people who reported feeling anxious.
Okay.
This study, it surveyed over 2,000 British mobile phone users.
Right.
And found that a significant 53% felt anxious when they lost their phone, or the battery died, or they ran out of credit, or just had no network coverage.
Wow. 53%. That's more than half.
Exactly. And looking at the breakdown, it was slightly more common in men, at 58%, compared to 47% of women.
Interesting.
Plus, another 9% admitted to feeling stressed even when their phones were simply switched off.
Wow. Okay, so more than half feeling anxious just by being disconnected in some way. That really puts those little moments of phone-related worry into a much broader context.
It really does.
And didn't they even compare the level of that stress to other experiences?
They did, yeah. And this raises an important question about just how impactful this anxiety can be. The study actually compared the stress of nomophobia to things like the jitters you get before a wedding.
No way.
And even the anxiety associated with a trip to the dentist.
The dentist. Wow, that's a surprising comparison.
It is, isn't it? It really emphasizes the emotional weight of being without a phone for many individuals. So what this suggests is that for over half the population, the absence of this, small piece of technology triggers a stress response similar to significant life events.
That really highlights how deeply integrated our phones have become. Like an external hard drive for our lives and our anxieties, maybe.
That's a good way to put it. Exactly. Almost an extension of ourselves.
So, given that level of stress, is this officially recognized as a mental health condition? Like, is it in the DSM?
That's an interesting point. So, while nomophobia isn't currently listed in the DSM-5, that's the latest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Right, the main diagnostic manual.
Exactly. The handbook used by mental health professionals is not in there yet. But there has been a suggestion to classify it as a specific phobia.
Okay.
This proposal was based on the criteria defined in the DSM-IV, which was the previous version.
Okay.
So while it's not formally recognized in the current manual, it's definitely something that researchers and clinicians are aware of and are studying.
Got it. So we're talking about a noticeable level of anxiety for a lot of people. What are some of the sort of fundamental reasons why this fear might take hold? What's underneath it?
Well, what's fascinating here is that nomophobia is often understood through the lens of what's called behavioral addiction.
Okay, behavioral addiction, like gambling or something.
Sort of, yeah. Essentially, this refers to a dependence on a behavior for reward or relief. Similar in some ways to substance addiction, but obviously without a physical substance.
Right.
In the case of nomophobia, the reward might be that feeling of connection or the constant access to information that our phones provide. And one key potential cause highlighted in the research is simply this constant internet access. This always-on connectivity can become something people feel they absolutely need.
That makes sense. It's not just about the physical phone, it's about what it connects us to.
Precisely. And if we dig a little deeper, the sources point to underlying emotional factors as potential contributors, too.
Like what?
Things like generally higher levels of anxiety to begin with, maybe low self-esteem,
Okay.
what psychologists call insecure attachment styles in relationships, patterns of relating to others characterized by anxiety about closeness or maybe avoidance of intimacy,
Right.
or even just a general tendency towards emotional instability can play a role.
So people might be using their phones to cope with those feelings.
Exactly. Some people might find themselves overusing their phones as a way to seek comfort or reassurance in their relationships. It's almost like the phone becomes a kind of security blanket in some ways.
That's a helpful way to think about it.
Yeah.
And I know you mentioned earlier research. There was a 2005 study by Bianchi and Phillips that looked at psychological factors in excessive phone use, right? Even back then.
That's right, even back in 2005.
Uh-huh.
And they identified a couple of key psychological factors. Low self-esteem was one,
Mhm.
where individuals might use their phones a lot as a way to get that reassurance or validation from others online.
Okay.
And the other was having an extroverted personality.
Oh, really? Extroverted. How so?
Well, people who are naturally very social might use their phones excessively just to maintain a huge number of connections, keep up with everyone constantly.
Ah, interesting. So it's almost two sides of the same coin needing that external input, whether it's driven by insecurity or maybe a really strong social drive.
Exactly. It seems like individuals who perhaps have a more fragile sense of self, whether that expresses itself through needing external validation or maybe struggling with social interaction, might be particularly vulnerable to this dependence.
Okay.
And furthermore, the research indicates that the symptoms we associate with nomophobia could also be linked to pre-existing mental health conditions.
Like anxiety disorders.
Yeah, particularly social phobia or social anxiety disorder, and also panic disorder. It's not always an isolated issue. If someone already has anxiety around social situations, the phone might feel like a really crucial safety net for them.
Absolutely, I can see that. And there was another survey, wasn't there, by Secure Envoy that looked at who might be more prone to this.
Yes, exactly. That survey offered some really interesting insights into demographics. They found that young adults and teenagers are significantly more likely to experience nomophobia.
Right, that makes sense.
In fact, a striking 77% of teenagers reported feeling anxious when they were without their phones.
77%. Wow.
Yeah. The 25-34 age group was next, but interestingly, even individuals over 55 reported experiencing this anxiety too.
So it crosses generations, but definitely hits younger people harder. That generational breakdown is quite telling, isn't it? Shows how deeply ingrained these devices are for younger demographics.
It really does. And the research also points to a set of psychological characteristics that might make someone more susceptible.
Okay, like what sort of traits?
These include things like having negative views of oneself, being younger, obviously, having low self-esteem and a lack of confidence in one's own abilities, what psychologists call low self-efficacy,
Right.
being either highly extroverted, as we mentioned, or even highly introverted.
Oh, interesting. Both extremes.
Yeah, potentially for different reasons. Also being impulsive, feeling a constant sense of urgency, and being someone who actively seeks out intense experiences or sensations.
So it's a real mix, how we see ourselves, our age, our personality traits, how we manage impulses.
Yeah.
It all seems to feed into this vulnerability.
Precisely. It's usually a combination of factors.
Now, let's shift to the impact of this, particularly on younger individuals, like students. I came across something quite stark about the sheer amount of time they spend on their phones.
Yes, back in 2012, Shambhar, Rujambana, and Joa made a pretty strong statement. They suggested that cell phones are, and I quote, possibly the biggest non-drug addiction of the 21st century.
Wow, that's a big claim.
It is. They also highlighted that college students might spend up to an astounding 9 hours every single day on their phones.
9 hours, that's more than a typical workday.
Exactly. It really brings up what they termed the paradox of technology, how something designed to, make our lives easier and connect us can actually become something that controls or enslaves us.
Yeah, freeing yet enslaving. So what kind of effect does that 9 hours a day actually have on their lives, like their academic performance?
Well, the research has shown a connection between this frequent cell phone use among students and some pretty concerning outcomes.
Yeah.
Specifically, it's been linked to lower grade point averages and increased levels of anxiety. And these, in turn, negatively affect their self-reported life satisfaction, basically, their overall sense of well-being and happiness.
That's a pretty significant impact. Lower grades, more anxiety, less happy overall. What are the likely reasons behind this connection?
It seems like several factors probably contribute. First, just the sheer amount of time spent on phones
Right, the 9
and
hours.
inevitably takes away from time and focus that could be dedicated to studying, attending classes, doing assignments. That's pretty straightforward.
Makes sense.
Second, the constant notifications, the pull of social media. It can be incredibly distracting, especially during lectures or trying to concentrate on work. There's also the pressure some feel to be constantly connected to their social networks, which can be mentally exhausting in itself.
Yeah, that fear of missing out. FOMO.
Exactly. And finally, excessive phone use can reduce opportunities for what we might call perceived solitude, that quiet time we need to think, process, de-stress, and just recharge without constant input.
So we lose that valuable downtime.
Pretty much. So while phones offer connection, that very connection can also become a source of stress, distraction, and maybe even prevent us from getting the mental rest we need.
Right. The research really highlights this dual nature, doesn't it?
It does.
Mobile phones can certainly help us connect with loved ones, meet our needs for affection, understanding, support,
Fulfill important interpersonal needs.
and even help us manage our emotions sometimes. But on the other hand, they can also become significant sources of stress themselves.
Absolutely. Due to work demands pinging us after hours, the constant stream of communication we feel obliged to respond to, and just the rapid flow of information hitting us all day.
So what happens when that constant connection gets disrupted, even just for a little while, like the battery dying?
Well, this is where we really see the emotional impact of nomophobia kick in.
Okay.
If someone's phone battery dies unexpectedly, or maybe there's a sudden drop in notifications they usually get,
Yeah.
they might experience quite negative emotions, things like anxiety, irritability, even feelings associated with depression. It can be a noticeable shift in their emotional state, directly tied to their phone access.
Wow. That really underscores the dependence that can develop, doesn't
It
it?
really does.
And I recall seeing a study that specifically linked overall phone usage to levels of happiness.
Yes, that's likely the 2019 study by Volkmer and Lermer. They found a correlation between wider, more pervasive mobile phone use and lower reported levels of happiness, mindfulness, and overall life satisfaction.
So more phone use linked to feeling less happy and satisfied.
That's what their findings suggested, yeah. It hints that while phones offer a lot of convenience and connection, excessive engagement might come at a cost to our general well-being.
This all points to a pretty significant attachment to these devices. Is that attachment just about what the phone does for us, the functions? Or is there something deeper, like a psychological connection happening?
The research suggests it often goes beyond just functionality. There was an Australian study in 2010
Yeah.
that looked specifically at adolescents and young adults. They found evidence of what they called excessive use and a real psychological attachment to their phones, even when there wasn't a diagnosable mental health issue present.
Interesting. So attached, even if not technically addicted or phobic yet?
Exactly. And what was particularly interesting was that those who use their phones more often also tended to increase their usage when they received positive feedback or validation from others online.
So getting likes or positive comments made them use it more.
Yeah, it circles back to that idea of seeking reassurance through the phone.
Right.
And the focus on adolescence here is important. The study noted that this age group can be particularly vulnerable to developing a dependency on mobile phones.
Why is that?
Well, it's a crucial stage for developing their sense of self, their identity, building self-esteem, establishing their social standing. And the validation they get online can become a really powerful driver of how much they use their phones. It's almost like their sense of self gets intertwined with their online presence and the feedback they get there.
That's a potentially concerning thought, that their self-worth gets tied up in online validation mediated by the phone.
It can be, yeah.
And this isn't just limited to young people, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned other studies.
Not at all. There was a Brazilian study that compared individuals who had diagnosed panic disorders with a control group.
Yeah.
And they found that a significant 68% of all participants, both groups, reported some level of mobile phone dependency.
68%. That's high across the board.
It is. But here's the key difference. Those with panic disorder and agoraphobia, they reported experiencing significantly more emotional symptoms and a greater sense of dependency when they couldn't access their phones.
More distress when cut off.
Exactly. Even though they were actually less likely to make traditional voice calls compared to the control group.
Wait, so they depended on it more emotionally, but used it less for actual call?
Isn't that fascinating? It really highlights the phone's role as a kind of safety signal or emotional regulator for them, even if they're not actively using it for communication in the traditional sense.
Wow, okay. That makes the dependency aspect clearer.
Yeah. And the research also talks about related issues, like what's sometimes called overconnection syndrome.
Overconnection syndrome, what's that?
It's where spending too much time connected via phones leads to fewer face-to-face interactions, which can then negatively impact real-world social and family relationships.
Right, replacing face-to-face with screen time.
Exactly. And then there's kind of the flip side, sometimes termed techno-stress.
Techno stress.
Yeah, where people might actually avoid real-world interactions by retreating into the digital world via their phones. This can, unfortunately, contribute to feelings of isolation and mood disorders like depression.
So it's a bit of a potential cycle. Relying on the phone might actually worsen the very anxieties or social difficulties it seems to temporarily soothe.
That's a really key point, yes. It can become a maladaptive coping mechanism.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty then. What are some of the really clear signs or symptoms that someone might be experiencing nomophobia? What should people look out for?
Well, anxiety is really the core emotional response, as the name suggests.
Right, Scopia.
Exactly. So, key triggers for that anxiety typically include the actual loss of the phone.
The pocket pat panic.
Yeah, losing network reception, so seeing no service.
Ugh, yeah.
And of course, the dreaded dead battery. Those are the big three triggers.
Okay. And clinically, what might professionals observe?
Clinically, we might see things like impulsive device use, just picking it up constantly without thinking, using the phone almost as a barrier or protection in social situations.
Like something to hide behind.
Sort of, yeah. Or even treating it like a comfort object, what psychologists sometimes call a transitional object.
Like a child might have a favorite blanket or toy for comfort.
Exactly that kind of idea. The phone serves that soothing function.
Okay. And what about observable behaviors? Things friends or family might notice.
Yeah, behaviorally, you might notice someone owning multiple internet-enabled devices, maybe to ensure they always have a backup, always carrying a charger, maybe even multiple chargers or power banks.
The charger anxiety.
Totally. Expressing significant anxiety just at the thought of misplacing their phone, even if it hasn't happened.
Right.
This anxiety can also really disrupt their sleep patterns, checking the phone late at night, keeping it by the bed,
Yeah.
which, as we've discussed, can then contribute to further mental health issues like depression and just a general lack of self-care because they're tired and stressed.
It cascades.
It really can. And over time, this reliance can also be linked to a decrease in self-esteem and a reduced ability to cope with everyday stressors without the phone as a crutch.
Okay. And what about specific symptoms? You mentioned anxiety, but what else?
Well, some specific symptoms include a growing preference for communicating through text, social media, or messaging apps rather than face-to-face or even voice calls. Keeping the phone constantly within reach, like on the table during meals, in the bathroom.
Guilty as charged sometimes.
Huh? Many of us are. Keeping it nearby while sleeping and never turning it off.
Right.
Frequently checking the screen for notifications, even when none have arrived, that phenomenon sometimes called ringxiety or phantom vibrations.
Oh, yeah, feeling your phone buzz when it didn't. I've had that.
It's quite common. Financially, nomophobia can sometimes contribute to debt, maybe from excessive data usage charges or constantly upgrading to the latest devices.
Right.
And then there can be physical manifestations, too.
Like what?
People might experience issues like sore elbows, text elbow, or sore hands and necks from repetitive use and awkward postures while looking down at the screen.
I've definitely felt that neck strain after a long scrolling session. It's a real thing.
Absolutely. It's a real physical consequence.
Any other signs?
Yeah, in more extreme cases, individuals might have irrational and intense reactions in public places where phone use is restricted, like maybe on airplanes before takeoff or in hospitals.
Okay.
An over-reliance on the phone for everyday tasks, like making purchases or navigation, could also lead to significant problems if the phone isn't functioning for some reason.
Right, if your whole wallet and map is on the phone.
Exactly. You might also observe signs of distress, maybe even symptoms that look like depression if they don't receive regular contact or notifications through their phone. That lack of input feels like a lack of connection or validation.
And as we touched on earlier, nomophobia can often be connected to other underlying conditions, right? It doesn't always exist in isolation.
Yes, absolutely. It can act as a kind of indicator or maybe even an amplifier of other disorders.
How so?
Well, individuals who already experience social anxiety, for instance, are likely to feel increased nervousness, anxiety, distress, maybe physical symptoms like sweating and trembling when they're separated from their devices, due to a low battery, lack of service, or just not having the phone with them. They might even go to considerable lengths to retrieve a forgotten phone, like turning back home even if it makes them late.
Right. That reliance can then unfortunately reinforce their social anxiety, can it?
Exactly. It creates a dependence on virtual communication as a way to lessen the stress of actual face-to-face interactions. So the phone becomes both the perceived problem because it enables avoidance and the attempted solution because it reduces immediate anxiety.
That's a key insight, a tricky cycle.
Very much so. And for those with panic disorders, remember the Brazilian study.
Yeah.
While they might exhibit nomophobic behaviors, they often report feelings of rejection, loneliness, insecurity, and low self-esteem specifically related to their phones, particularly during times of low contact or fewer notifications.
So not getting messages makes them feel rejected or lonely.
It seems so. And this can paradoxically lead to increased anxiety and depression, even though, as we know, they might be less inclined to make actual voice calls themselves.
It sounds like a really intricate mix of emotions and behaviors tied up with the device.
It really is.
And can this nomophobia even contribute to risky actions?
Yes, that's a critical point. Nomophobia has been linked in research to an increased likelihood of what's considered problematic mobile phone use.
Like what?
Things such as dependent use, like never turning it off, feeling unable to, prohibited use, using it in places where it's explicitly not allowed, like cinemas or meetings, and importantly, dangerous use.
Dangerous use, like texting while driving.
Exactly, most notably using a phone while driving or even while crossing the street. And interestingly, research suggests that the fear of missing out on information seems to be the strongest predictor of illegal phone use while driving. Not just social connection, but missing information.
Wow. That fear of missing out, FOMO,
Yeah.
taken to a really dangerous extreme.
Precisely.
So just to recap the core symptoms someone might experience if they're struggling with this, what are the key anxiety and emotional ones?
Okay, so the core anxiety symptoms often include things like changes in breathing, maybe faster or shallower,
Right.
trembling, perspiration, or sweating, feeling agitated or restless, maybe some disorientation, and a racing heartbeat or tachycardia.
Okay, classic anxiety response.
Yes. And then the core emotional symptoms often reported include feelings of depression, experiencing panic attacks, intense fear around being disconnected, a strong sense of dependence on the phone, feelings of being rejected or lonely, particularly related to phone interactions, and low self-esteem.
That's a pretty significant list of potential impacts on someone's daily life and well-being.
It really can be, yeah.
So given that this is a relatively new area of study, as you mentioned, what do we actually know about how to approach treating nomophobia? Are there effective treatments?
You're right. Because it's a more recent concept, treatments that have been rigorously tested specifically for nomophobia are still somewhat limited. It's an emerging field. However, there are definitely promising approaches being explored and adapted from treatments for similar conditions.
Like what?
Things like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT.
Common for anxiety.
Very common, yeah. CBT helps people identify and change those negative thought patterns and behaviors related to phone use and disconnection. EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing, a type of psychotherapy often used for trauma, has also shown some potential.
Okay.
And sometimes combining therapy with medication is considered.
Right. And I remember reading one slightly more practical suggestion.
Ah, yes. Interestingly, one very practical suggestion that has come up in the research is simply increasing the availability of mobile phone charging stations in public areas.
Huh. That's a surprisingly simple but potentially helpful idea for reducing that battery anxiety piece.
It is, isn't it? A direct way to address at least one common trigger.
Yeah. What about medications? Have any been specifically studied?
Well, some studies have shown that certain drugs like tranylcipramine and clonazepam, which are primarily used for conditions like social anxiety or panic disorder,
Right.
have been effective in reducing the effects or symptoms associated with nomophobia in some individuals. But again, they're treating the underlying anxiety, not nomophobia itself technically.
Got it. So the therapy, like CBT, aims to change the thinking and behavior.
Exactly. CBT aims to help people develop a sense of autonomy and engage in behaviors that aren't so reliant on technology, build confidence in managing without the phone constantly.
Mm.
There's also a therapeutic approach called reality therapy that's been mentioned. This encourages individuals to shift their focus and behaviors away from their phones and towards more direct, real-world interactions and responsibilities, taking control of their choices.
Okay. And what about more severe cases? Is medication used then?
In more severe cases, healthcare professionals might consider neuropsychopharmacology, basically, using medications like benzodiazepines, which are anti-anxiety drugs, or antidepressants.
Right.
But it's really crucial to remember, again, that these aren't specifically designed or approved to treat nomophobia directly. They'd be used primarily if there's a significant underlying anxiety or depressive disorder.
So the focus should really be on investigating and treating any underlying mental health issues first and foremost.
Absolutely, that's key. It's often not just about getting rid of the phone dependence, but about understanding and addressing the deeper reasons behind the anxiety and dependence. Why is the phone fulfilling such a crucial role for this person?
Makes perfect sense. And are there ways to actually diagnose this? You mentioned it's not in the DSM-5, but are there tools?
Yes, precisely. And while it's a relatively new field, there are already validated questionnaires and psychometric scales available that have been developed to help diagnose or assess nomophobia.
Oh, okay. Like what?
One example mentioned in the research is the Questionnaire of Dependence of Mobile Phone, sometimes abbreviated as QDMP, or the Test of Mobile Phone Dependence, the TMPD. These kinds of validated tools can help clinicians and researchers to better understand the severity and specific aspects of nomophobia in an individual.
Good to know there are ways to measure it.
Yeah.
So to kind of sum things up then, it really sounds like nomophobia is a very real and probably increasingly relevant anxiety in our constantly connected world.
That's a really good way to put it. Nomophobia is indeed a significant modern anxiety, and it's deeply connected to our growing reliance on mobile phones.
Yeah.
It clearly involves both psychological components, the fear, the anxiety, the impact on self-esteem, and behavioral aspects like the compulsive checking and avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
And it can have noticeable negative effects on our well-being, our sleep, even how we perform academically or at work.
And it's often linked to those underlying anxieties we talked about.
Exactly. It's frequently linked to underlying anxieties, personality traits, and can show up in that wide range of emotional and even physical symptoms we listed.
It definitely gives you something to think about, doesn't it?
It really does.
And it makes you wonder, with our ever-increasing interconnectedness through technology, how do we find a healthy middle ground? How do we actually strike a balance?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah. How do we take advantage of all the benefits of these amazing mobile devices without becoming overly dependent and anxious?
Mm-hmm.
Is this constant state of being connected truly benefiting our overall well-being in the long run? Or are we, maybe unintentionally, creating new kinds of stress and maybe even disconnection in our real offline lives?
It's a crucial reflection for all of us.
Yeah, it's certainly something for all of us listening to consider in our own relationship with our phones.
Mhm.
How attached are we? When does it cross a line?
And maybe this leads to a final thought for our listeners. As technology continues to evolve at this rapid pace and becomes even more integrated into every aspect of our lives, understanding and, importantly, addressing phenomena like nomophobia is likely going to become increasingly important for our collective mental health and well-being as a society. We need to learn how to manage this relationship healthily.
Absolutely well fed. And for those of you who are interested in learning more after this discussion, some related ideas or concepts you might want to explore further include things like problematic smartphone use in general,
A broader category.
the ongoing research into the impact of screen time and digital media use on mental health,
Yeah, huge area.
internet addiction disorder, which is
Yeah.
another related concept,
Right.
that idea of technostress we mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even the fear of being alone itself, which is sometimes known as autophobia, and how phones might play into managing or avoiding that.
Lots of connected threads there.
Definitely. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today into the world of nomophobia.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating and important topic.